There we are. Hello everyone, welcome to the next episode of my science podcast. Today I'm really delighted to welcome Professor Judith Bronstein, who is a professor of ecology and evolutionary biology at the University of Arizona, who specialises in studying mutualisms and examining how population processes, abiotic conditions and the community context determine net effects on these interactions. Her recent empirical work has focused on exploited pollination mutualisms in deserts, desert grasslands, and montane habitats in Arizona and Colorado. As an ambassador in her field, she has been elected president of the American Society of Naturalists. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
So to start off with, may you tell us about your career and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, everybody has such an individual story. I think my story is one in which, as a child, I was very influenced by the first strong growth of environmentalism in the US, which was in the 1970s, concern about air quality and water quality. And I very much wanted to contribute to conserving the environment. At the same time, I was very, very academically oriented. So I loved studying, I loved learning new things. So when I went to college, I thought I was going to be mostly interested in environmental policy making, environmental law, something along those lines. But as soon as I started taking ecology courses, I discovered that what I was really passionately interested in was the basic discovery and basic science. But at the same time, I think that I'm just fundamentally a scholar. And so if I had not gone into academic biology, I think honestly, I would have gone into academic history or comparative literature, something that would have put me in the university rather than, environmental policy making or government or anything like that. I think academia was really where my heart was. I think the first time I stepped onto a college campus, I sort of felt like I don't want anyone to ever make me leave this place. It's like, this is where I belong. And so probably late in my undergraduate years, I decided to get a doctorate in ecology and to stay in academia. And then I was very single-minded in pursuing that as a field.
Amazing. And you are the woman of the field. So right now, this is amazing. So may you explain the evolutionary origins and maintenance of mutualism, as from endosymbiosis and creation of the eukaryotic cell far back, these relationships have really shaped our ecosystems. Yet plant insect mutualisms have apparently both arisen and been lost repeatedly. So can you tell us about this?
Yeah, sure. Well, let me just say, with regard to the field of mutualism, the history of the field of ecology is very tied up with, strife and death and things like that, competition, predation, parasitism, right back to the origins of our field. And so the study of mutualism was a very, very late development. A lot was known about mutualisms, like lots of good stories going back thousands of years. But it wasn't really a field of study. And, one of the reasons I'm prominent now is that I was one of the first people to get really interested in it as a field. So my job, if you think of it that way, was to convince people it was interesting enough to study, which was a bit of an uphill climb when I was early in my career. But what that means now that the field is sort of flourishing is I've seen it develop all along the way. It also kind of means I'm the oldest person who studies it, and I know everybody, which is kind of funny. So with regard to your question, it's a great question about so mutualisms, stepping back, are interactions between two species. So it's always between species. in which both partners benefit from the interaction. So it's everything from, the origin of the eukaryotic cell, which, we can recognize now that mitochondria used to be their own living creatures. And so there is a mutual benefit in the cell and the mitochondria within it, although at this point it's impossible to separate them. So we can't say they do better together than when they're apart, because they can't be apart. They range from that to things like two organisms that have never encountered each other before in evolutionary history, but you put them together and they both do really well. Like, for instance, an invasive plant in Australia that came, let's say, from North America, in association with an invasive pollinator, let's say the honeybee, which came from Africa, right? So they newly encounter each other and they form a really mutually beneficial interaction. That's a mutualism too. So because of that, because it's everything from the eukaryotic cell to interaction, to partners that just became acquainted yesterday, there are many different origins of mutualism and many different paths to get there, right? So some of them, like the eukaryotic cell, and like many plant pollinator interactions, for instance, probably started as antagonisms. So one partner benefited and the other was harmed, right? So pollination, it's thought, probably started with tiny insects wandering across flowers and eating pollen, right? So that which is bad for a plant. And then it became mutualism when natural selection led the plant to produce something else for these animals to eat in the form of nectar. And so less pollen got eaten and more of it got moved between flowers, right? So you still have a pollinator that consumes stuff, but you move from it being a negative interaction to being a positive interaction. The eukaryotic cell was probably like that. I think the original idea is that the sort of ancestral mitochondrion got eaten by cells. And the first step along the way to it becoming, the obligate, utterly intertwined thing it is now, is that the thing that got eaten survived after it was eaten and then started to benefit the cell that it was in, right? So both of those, I mean, as different mutualisms as you could possibly imagine, kind of have a similarity in that they started as what we would say plus minus interactions, so benefiting one, harming the other, to plus plus interactions, benefiting one and benefiting the other. Other mutualisms seem to have different roots, where they, for instance, started out as commensalisms, which are interactions that benefit one and have absolutely no effect on the other. But for one reason or another, the partner that was not affected evolved into a partner that was benefited by the interaction. So with understanding the evolution of mutualism, you could say, well, how could we know this because it's so far in the past? And that's a huge challenge, to some extent we can't possibly do experiments to know some things, right? So what's left? Do we just sort of tell nice stories about, oh, it must have happened this way? There's ways around that, there's interactions. Some of the most exciting work going on right now is going on in laboratories where people are using pairs of microbes that they're growing together and putting them in situations in which there should be very strong selection for mutual benefit to emerge. And so you can do lab experiments, it's called experimental evolution, in which you take two partners, either from a negative interaction or from the situation in which they've never encountered each other before, you put them together in culture and create conditions in which there's a very, very strong advantage in them being mutualist. So you can actually watch evolution happen in the lab. And that's some of the most exciting evidence we have for how mutualism evolves.
Definitely. So in what way does sex differences in pollinator behavior have consequences for the mutualism, as I've read in one of your papers that sex-associated differences can in some cases be larger than differences between species.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And when we talk about mutualism, we're talking about two species, right? It's like a plant and a pollinator. So like digitalis and bumblebees or something like that. But that blurs over a lot of important variation within species, right? It's assuming when we simplify it like that and say it's an interaction between two species, you aren't really paying attention to the fact that not every flower is identical and not every pollinator is identical. And that would be true whatever kind of mutualism we're talking about, right? It happens that pollination is such a familiar example. And it's also pretty easily studied. So we tend to focus on that one. So yeah, one of my graduate students, Gordon Smith, got very interested in this question. We work on hawk moths, which are these giant night-flying moths that are extremely good pollinators, but not nearly as well studied as bees. Mm-hmm. And Gordon and the rest of us on this team discovered that if you look at the pollen that the moths are carrying, so let me say, these moths fly at night. They're very strong flyers. They're flying many kilometers a night. You can't watch them, right? I mean, you can watch them at any one plant, but you don't really know how they spend their night. So how could you know that? You catch a moth and you see what pollen it's carrying on its body. And that tells you the only way they can get pollen on their body is if they visited that plant species. So we were looking at individuals, many, many individuals of the same species of hawk moth. And what Gordon noticed is that the males and the females were carrying different pollens, which means they must be doing different things during the night. Now, we know they're doing different things in the night, and we know where they've been, right? Because there's a record of the pollen. Why are they doing that? This we don't know, right? Why are males prioritizing some flowers over others? Is it because there is something that males do? For instance, males in these species and in many insect species range very wide, looking for females. And females tend to stay really local. And that's just a basic thing about how their behavior. So you could imagine that that could lead males and females to be different in a couple of ways. One is, well, if males are searching a very broad area for females, maybe males encounter more flowers and are picking up more pollens. It might be that because the males have to search far and wide for the females, they really need to tank up on good fuel to do that. So maybe they're choosing the flowers that have particularly high amounts of nectar, because nectar is their fuel, it has lots of sugar in it, or has better, either more fuel, like more nectar, or better fuel, like certain kinds of sugars. So there's a lot of possibilities as to why that is. Now, why is that a story about mutualism and not just a story about how moths forage? Because the pollens that the moths have on them is an indication of who they could be pollinating, so who their mutualists are. And the interesting thing about what those data imply is that males should be pollinators of a somewhat different set of plants than females are, right? And that, that's really interesting. Does that mean, let's imagine that for a given plant species, it's going to attract a lot more males than females. Does that mean natural selection will act differently on the rewards it produces? Can it differentially attract one sex of pollinator over the other? We don't know these things. This isn't just restricted to these moths. If you look at other kinds of pollinators, including hummingbirds, for instance, in the US, males and females are not identical. Male and female hummingbirds have slightly different bill lengths, and that can make a big difference in what flowers they visit and and who pollinates them. And that should play out to be relevant for their pollination mutualisms. It's probably equally true for other kinds of mutualisms where one partner has two very distinct types, right? Because what is sex? Sex is, in this context, two very distinct morphs of a mutualist that correspond to different behaviors. Well, there's other kinds of morphs too. Some of them are continuously distributed, like very big to progressively smaller and smaller and smaller, right? That's within species variation too. And yeah, it's entirely possible that the differences you see within species is just as big as between species, such that, taking my example of these moths, it might be that the females are somewhat larger than the males in these species. That large females of two different species behave more similarly than the large female and small male of within a species. And we haven't thought very much about that. How will that affect how mutualisms function, how it evolves? And this, I should say, it plays into a much broader interest in evolutionary biology about within species variation and what it means in ecology and evolution. Our end of asking that question has to do with mutualism. But that's in general a very big question right now that a lot of people are studying in a lot of different systems.
Definitely. I mean, that's fascinating, and it really highlights how new this field is and how much unknown surrounds the topic.
Yeah.
And there's a really delicate balance between mutualism and between cheating. So with some examples, please may you explain what the causes and consequences of cheating is within mutualisms?
Sure. Well, the idea of cheating, it's not the greatest term, but it carries the meaning. The idea with cheating is that you have an organism that could cooperate and be a mutualist, for whatever reason is not doing so, right? We tend to think of it as, well, it could cooperate, but for some reason it doesn't. There's other kinds of cheating. For instance, there's three kinds really. One is an individual has a choice. And it might choose to cooperate, it might choose to cheat. That's the easiest for us to conceptualize, because that's like humans, right? I could cooperate with my friend and study for the big exam, or I could steal her notes and I'll do really well, right? But there's two other kinds. One is that within a species, there are individuals that are cooperators and individuals that are cheaters, and this is just really hardwired. For instance, taking that example of males and females, or large individuals and small individuals. It could be that one does cooperative behaviors and one does cheating behaviors, and they can't switch, right? The third is species that are like freeloaders on the interaction, such that they've never been a mutualist in their evolutionary history, but they take advantage of the existence of a mutualist, and they take, and they cheat. So the best example of all three of those is, and the most familiar example to people, is in pollination mutualism. So sort of continuing this pollination theme. So how could you be a cooperator or a cheater? Well, the easiest cheating behavior to see in pollinators is that sometimes think of a flower that's a long tube, right? Because not all flowers look like that, but think of one that's a long tube. A pollinator could go in right past the pollen and the stigma and get the nectar and come out, and pollen gets deposited. They aren't trying to pollinate, right? In the course of feeding, they end up being pollinators. The other way many of these animals can do it, though, is instead of going in that way, they could chew a hole through the side of the flower and go in right where the nectar is and get the nectar out that way. They could get just as much, maybe more nectar, and they completely bypass picking up and depositing pollen. So let's call that cheating, okay? It's, technically it's nectar robbing. So let's call it cheating. So in one of the systems that I study in Colorado, an individual bee sometimes does one of those behaviors. Let's say it cooperates, it's a good pollinator, and sometimes it goes around the side of the flower and cheats. So we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out why an individual sometimes does one thing and sometimes does another thing. Is it that they learn that one of those two is going to get them more food and they stick with it? Or do they sort of randomly go back and forth between those two ways of feeding? Or do they learn that, or come up to a flower and somehow assess it and know that you can get more food in less time by doing one of those behaviors rather than the other? So that's the first kind of cheating. And so the challenge, if you like, for the plant is how to stop that, right? How to keep your pollinators honest, how to keep them cooperating and not defecting from the interaction. Assuming that it's bad to be cheated, which is actually something that's been surprisingly little studied. It's assumed that being cheated is a bad thing. Okay, so that's that first type. The second type would be if some individuals within that one species exclusively are cooperators and the others are exclusively cheaters. So I know of one plant in which the females always go in the right way and pollinate, and the males always chew a hole through the side of the flower and get the nectar out that way, right? So a female never does the male behavior, the males never do the female behavior. That's been surprisingly little studied, but it's known, right? It's like, why do the two sexes, kind of returning to our last question, why do the two sexes have such different behaviors? And what does that mean? And can the plant do anything about it, right? Because of course the plant, wants only the cooperative behaviors, wants only the females to come. So what does it do? Can it defend its flowers from being robbed? The third kind is where you have a species that doesn't ever pollinate and exclusively cheats. So for instance, in Arizona, I know some bees that only make holes in flowers, right? They never go in the right way. They exclusively act as nectar robbers. And so there's a mutualism between some other bees in those flowers. But this one bee never chooses to go in the right way. It only goes in the side, right? So you could say all three of those are the same thing, right? All three of them involve robbing of nectar the plant has to respond to. But it's three different ways of cheating. So the issue of cheating is enormous in the study of mutualism, particularly people who think about the evolution of mutualism. Many of them are convinced and have written very convincingly the idea that mutualism cannot persist through evolutionary time if mutualists ever have the temptation to cheat. The idea being, and I think this is because of our own conception of cheating because we're humans, is that cheating carries advantages, right? It's fast. We don't have to pay any cost of cooperating, right? It takes less time. It's like only good for you. And so there should be this temptation to cheat. And once you start going down that road, the idea is it's this slippery slope to the extinction of mutualism, because mutualists all will switch to cheating. And so that way of thinking leads you to think, well, partners must have some mechanism of stopping that. So for instance, there's a lot of talk about policing, such that a partner can recognize who the cheaters are and then punish them or keep them from doing that behavior. And then, that's a bit of a head scratcher if you work on things like mutualisms between plants and bacteria, because it's like, how can a plant individually punish bacteria that are cheating. It's like plants don't have little brains where they know who they're interacting with and then they can act accordingly. So how would that actually play out? So, it's a big end of this field to think about, well, how would policing even work, right? Do we have examples in nature of really effective policing such that mutualists are tempted to cheat, but then prevented from cheating? And the whole idea of policing very much, again, comes from our human conceptualization of human cooperation. It's like, why do we cooperate? And when you think about humans and then transfer it to other species, you have to get rid of ideas of like ethics and morality, because plants and bees, for instance, don't have ethics and morality, right? So it's strictly a matter of the idea would be humans will cheat unless we know we're going to be punished for it. And we don't have to be punished for it, but there has to be a pretty serious threat. Like, I will be thrown out of the university if I am caught cheating on the final exam. And that's enough of a punishment that I'm just not going to entertain that possibility, right? So as long as the threat of punishment is high enough, you stay honest. Or if you see other individuals being punished, you stay honest. And you actually do find cases like that in the natural world, which is pretty interesting. But you also, on the other hand, find an awful lot of cheating, which doesn't seem to be countered at all. And this is something I've spent a lot of years trying to figure out, which is like, if cheating is so bad, then first of all, why do we see it so commonly in nature? And why is it so hard to find really, really effective punishment and policing mechanisms? So I think there's a lot we have yet to learn about that.
Definitely. And the plant can be a cheater as well, because there's the orchids which give off the chemical signals of a female, but obviously aren't a female.
Right. And the pollinators and wasps come in and try to copulate with the flower because it smells, wasps are like very odor oriented. We look at it, we know it's an orchid. They look at it and they think it's a female wasp because it smells just like a female wasp. And they try to copulate with it. And in that process, they pick up and deposit pollen. There's flowers that have no nectar at all, but they look just like another flower species that grows with them that does have nectar. And pollinators visit them by mistake. Eventually, in all of these systems, pollinators generally learn. They learn that these orchids aren't females, and they learn that these nectarless flowers should be avoided, but only after making a few mistakes. And the success of the plants depend on there being just enough mistakes for it to work. So for instance, these orchid flowers, all it takes, is 2 visits for them to make seeds. They need to be copulated with once, and the flower deposits all its pollen on that one wasp. And then the wasp has to make a second mistake, try to copulate with another flower, and all that pollen gets dropped off. So the flower sits there waiting. It can wait for weeks. So a nice, perfect looking flower sitting there for weeks, waiting for those 2 mistakes. Right?
So the idea of mutualisms is huge. It's everything from, fig wasps to in the deep sea, symbionts with squid, like bioluminescent symbionts. It's huge. So in what way do you think that climate change driven shifts in phenology can have devastating impacts for these interactions? And what are the likelihoods of phenological mismatches occurring due to anthropogenic threats?
Yeah, so mutualisms are incredibly diverse. I mean, they involve every organism on the face of the planet. And the benefits that are exchanged are very diverse. So pollination, which we've been talking about, what the plant is getting is transportation, right? It's getting pollen moved. What the animal is getting usually is food, right? So it's an exchange of food for transportation. Other mutualisms are very different than that. With some, for instance, plants and certain fungi and bacteria underground, there's an exchange of two nutrients. So the plant has lots of carbon, it needs nitrogen. The bacteria has plenty of nitrogen, it needs carbon, and so there's an exchange. So these things are incredibly diverse. And the challenge I faced early in my career was convincing people that it wasn't just a grab bag of interactions that didn't have a whole lot to do with each other, right? That there was something that held them together, like that they all had in common, other than that there was mutual benefit, right? So I spent a lot of years sort of thinking, well, what are the big principles that cut across all these mutualisms? Well, one of the biggest now, and it kind of wasn't on the radar when I started, is threats from anthropogenic change, right? And there's a lot of kinds of threats that the world is posing to us, right? The one you mentioned is this idea of mismatch. So the idea is that mutualistic partners have to be present in the same place at the same time, right? I mean, that's the whole principle. If you're going to interact, you have to be able to find your partner. It has to be in the right place at the right time. Well, those species, with the exception of things like the eukaryotic cell, which again, the partners don't have independent autonomy anymore. But any mutualism in which the two partners have independent autonomy have somewhat different biologies and have a different range of conditions under which they could persist. So a plant, for instance, has a certain amount of water that it requires, a certain amount of temperature, a certain range of temperature that it can persist in, right? That are part of its niche. Well, the mutualists that plant depends on, so the pollinators, the dispersers of seeds, the things that grow underground, many other mutualisms involving plants. All those organisms have their own range of conditions under which they persist. So let's take a bee species, a random bee species. There's an amount of moisture it needs. There's a range of temperature it can survive under. Well, will those conditions be identical for the plant and for the bee? Absolutely identical. If it is, then, in a changing world, in a world that's heating up, let's say we expect and we see in most parts of the world, plants are flowering earlier and earlier because the good temperature conditions are happening earlier and earlier in the year. Do the pollinators have such similar requirements that they also will emerge earlier and earlier to the exact same extent? If they do, then it's going to be okay for the plants, at least as far as pollination goes, right? But we don't know. We know way more about what's happening with plants than we know about any of the animals or the microbes that they're depending on. There's definitely some very good studies that suggest that these things are not identically coupled, so that plants are moving earlier and earlier, but the pollinators are still showing up at the same time as they always did. And think about what that would mean. That means the pollinator, the plant does not have that pollinator. Now, the plant might have other pollinators that are early, right? They could be just as good, right? They could be just as good, particularly for plants that have very generalized requirements. They could be just as good. We don't know. We have to study that. But it's also possible that they move earlier and there's nobody. There's nobody pollinating them. Meanwhile, the bee, let's say, comes out the same time it always does, and whoops, the plant isn't there, right? Once again, if that pollinator is super generalized, it now has a different plant community than it had previously. Could be fine. Those plants could be just as good, maybe even better for nectar. Could be a disaster, right? A lot of that will depend on how specialized the interaction is. So for my graduate work, I studied this famous pollination mutualism between figs and fig wasps. That's an amazing mutualism because it's a one-to-one relationship. So more or less. One of these tiny wasps is the pollinator for one fig species, which can only be pollinated, so the wasp can only mate and breed inside the figs of that one species. And that fig can only be pollinated by the actions of that wasp. And then there's like 750 species pairs. What that means is if you decouple any one fig and fig wasp pair, you're out of luck.
Yeah.
The fig wasps cannot shift to another fig. They have no ability to use another fig tree. The figs have no ability to be pollinated by another fig wasp and no ability to self-pollinate, so they are simply out of luck. That's the extreme situation. Now, you would think that because of this, I could point to examples of what we call co-extinction, cases where one species has gone extinct and has driven its mutualists extinct. And of course, that's the worst case scenario. I cannot point to a single case in which that's happened.
Okay.
Right? Why? I mean, there's two possibilities there. One is it's happening all the time, but it's really hard to know. Actually, there's three possibilities. Could be happening all the time, and we don't recognize the signs of it happening because we don't study every species on Earth. Another possibility is it's happened in the past, but how would you know? If you find a fossil flower species that doesn't still present on the planet today, how would you know if its pollinator had gone extinct with it? Fossils don't tell you that. The third possibility is that mutualisms have more resiliency built into them. That as one partner goes down, the other partner has ecological and evolutionary options to shift partners. And this is something there's a lot of research on. It's obviously really, really critical for understanding the maintenance and loss of biodiversity. How resilient are these interactions? And then which ones do we need to worry about the most?
Definitely.
So, yeah.
So my next question is, why do you think mutualisms aren't being studied on a huge scale or weren't to start off with, despite the fact that almost every species on Earth is involved directly or indirectly in one or more of these interactions, and this field poses real opportunities for conservation in the future?
Yeah, I would agree with you. And it's a huge growth area right now. It's kind of I think, maybe I'm biased, a kind of sexy topic to get into. It used to be, I could really read every mutualism article that came out in a given year. And now I got a Google feed twice a week of mutualism articles, and I can't keep it all straight. There's actually quite a number of articles that have been written about why no one studies mutualism, right? And there's been like 7 ideas posed. One of them is this idea that humans are innately drawn to studying death and destruction, nature red in tooth and claw. That, as somebody put it, it's fun to go outside and watch things kill other things. It's not much fun to go outside and watch things cooperate with other things. Another idea is that it's due to a dearth of women in the field. And this argument, and I don't actually buy into this, is that if women dominated the field, there'd be much more of an interest in cooperation and coexistence. But because, like every other science field, it was heavily male dominated, that instead there was a tendency to focus on competition and strife. Interesting idea. There's certainly, a heck of a lot of women in the field right now. There's many explanations for why that might be, which is a whole other podcast. But I would say there's more women across all areas of ecology and evolutionary biology now than there used to be. And I haven't actually looked to see if the study of mutualism has more women than others. I just think, early in the study of ecology, really up until the 1960s, most things weren't being studied in depth. There was a small handful of things that were being studied in excruciating depth, like competition. And I think that's in part a legacy of Darwin and Darwin's emphasis on natural selection being a fundamental consequence of competition. And I think because of that, early ecologists wanted to go into nature and find evidence, actually, that there were differences among individuals and that those that were the superior competitors would tend to win out. The other thing it's a legacy of is that ecology has a strong legacy of applied biology. We study things because we needed to, because of agriculture and our own survival, right? So we needed to know how predators behaved because we needed to avoid them. We needed to know where our enemies were. But that also includes enemies of our cattle and sheep and goats, if we're agriculturalists. It's a matter of knowing, is there enough grass for my cattle and sheep and goats? And what can I do to make sure that there's a plentiful enough food supply? So the study of mutualism, because of that, the one mutualism that we had a huge store of knowledge before we really had a field of studying it, was pollination, because it was critical in agriculture. So the basics of pollination, were worked out long ago. You can find, probably in the British Museum and many museums I know, there are these bas reliefs of Assyrian agriculture. And you see the Assyrian gods sprinkling pollen on date flowers to increase the date crop. And this was seen as a godly function. What it also tells us is the ancient Assyrians knew how to produce a date crop. They knew that they had to get pollen, and they knew they had to put it on flowers, right? And they knew that animals did it, but that you could get a higher crop if you did it yourself. That's the inception of the field of study of mutualism.
Definitely. So I guess my final question is, what can be done to protect these mutual relationships?
Yeah, and this gets into the question of what are the biggest threats to mutualism. I talked about this question about phenological mismatch. That's really a question of climate change, right? It's the idea that as climates change, all organisms will either adjust or die. And mutualisms will have to do so as well. Is that the biggest threat to mutualism? We have no idea yet. Clearly, we need to do something to avert climate change, right? And preserving mutualisms is one of many reasons why that's the case. I would say, though, the most imminent threat to mutualisms is habitat loss.
Yeah.
It's losing native habitats, and it's fragmenting the habitat that's left. So for instance, if you're a bee and you are critical to plants because you move around and drink nectar and pollinate them, and then you take your habitat and you carve it up into little pieces such that there's empty forest or agricultural fields in between little patches. Will pollination persist? Well, it will if the bees can fly between those patches. Will they fly between the patches? This is the kind of thing we don't know, right? So we're losing habitat, we're disrupting how these interactions function. Even if they can continue to function in a little patch, it may not be enough for the partners to survive. And that's especially true when you talk about mutualists that really move far distances. This has been particularly well studied in seed dispersal by bats and big birds, particularly in the tropics. So for instance, on Guam, every single native vertebrate seed disperser has been driven extinct. And the reason is largely because of invasive species, some of which were brought intentionally to Guam. So you have forests in Guam, the plants just, the seeds never get dispersed. And so this is being studied, particularly by looking at some of the other small islands around Guam that have been less disturbed, that still have their set of mutualists intact. And so you can look at what happens when you completely lose your mutualists, right? Is there any way that those plants are going to persist?
Yeah.
You know, I would say we need more studies like that, but of course we don't want to create conditions in which we do that. You want to find conditions in which that's already happened.
Yeah.
You want to study them, and then you want to go about fixing it, right? You want to reintroduce lost mutualists. And that's another critical need, is that there should be a restoration ecology of mutualists. And people are trying this. You know, it's hard to do. I know people who are actually reintroducing monkeys to areas in the Brazilian rainforest that have lost their monkeys because of they've been hunted out. Monkeys are many are critical in seed dispersal. So they're actually trying to bring back troops of very large monkeys, get them established in an area to preserve monkeys, but also to increase the health of the plant populations. That's an awfully tough and ambitious goal. But, you know, wouldn't it be great if it worked? You know, we need bold people who are willing to do that, willing to figure out how to make it work. And I think that's going to help. I think that's going to help the world.
Absolutely. So to finish, would you like to tell us about your most recent work, or perhaps about a mutualism which has not been studied very much, as perhaps an opportunity for the future?
Oh, that's such a great question. Well, let me tell you just briefly about a plant species I study and why it's really interesting from the perspective of all of these mysteries about mutualism. And it's a plant that's pollinated by these big hawk moths. It's why we study the hawk moths. And it's a plant called Jimson weed. It's famous because it's an incredibly intense hallucinogen of North America. And so there's a lot of really interesting ethnobotany about this plant and its hallucinogenic properties, which have been known for 5,000 years. But the plant, although the plant is just loaded with these compounds, it's pollinated by these giant hawk moths who are completely unaffected by those toxins, I should say. And what the moth does is it comes in, it drinks nectar from the flowers. And then the females turn around and lay eggs on the plant. And the larvae, the caterpillars, proceed to eat the leaves. And again, they're unaffected by these incredible toxins. And the caterpillars eat and they eat and they eat until there are no leaves left. So here you have a plant, and the plant can pretty much only be pollinated by that moth. So here is a plant that has put all its eggs into one basket. It has gone exclusively, it has evolved to specialize on this pollinator. And yet the pollinator also appears to be its worst enemy, right? It eats every single last leaf. So this gets to the idea that there are costs of mutualism, that when we think about mutualism, we think about the good it does. Oh, my seeds get dispersed. Oh, my flowers get pollinated, you know, and so on and so on. But mutualisms, they require investments, right? And so, for instance, to attract these pollinators, the flowers have to make nectar. Makes a huge amount of nectar. These plants are sitting in the Sonoran Desert. We get about 6 inches of rain a year. Where does all that water come from? I don't know, but they're clearly investing a lot in attracting this moth. So there's a cost to the mutualism in terms of attracting the pollinators you need. There's another cost in that you proceed to lose all your leaves. So I'm really interested in the costs of mutualism. And I think to understand mutualism from the perspective of what's good about it and why organisms evolve to foster mutualistic relationships, we can't lose sight of the flip side of it, all the negative things that's associated with cooperation. It's a reminder that, and I think this is true for most interactions, yeah, that interaction between the plant and the hawk moth is a mutualism, but it's not only a mutualism, right? Simultaneously, it's an antagonism. It's a plus-minus interaction because the moth benefits from eating the leaves and the moth suffers from eating the leaves. So it's both a plus-plus interaction and a plus-minus interaction. So if I sit here and say, I'm an expert on the study of mutualism, is it right for me to forget about all the other kinds of interactions? That would be a disaster. Because I couldn't, with this interaction I study, I'm missing 50% or more of what's going on if I study it only as a mutualism. And one thing that's been in my mind lately is that really the case for mutualisms as a whole? That we always have to remember that they're more than mutualisms. And conversely, when you think about competitive interactions, you know, which benefit neither partner, right? Because you're competing for a limited resource. Under what conditions might one or both of them be benefiting from each other's presence? We kind of know that happens. So we typically, in the study of ecology, we polarize all these interactions into being different things, right? There's mutualism, and there's predation, and there's competition. And sort of the goal that I'm thinking I want to embark on in the next X number of years is to make all those divisions go away and to see the ecology and evolution of interactions as a whole thing, with all kinds of interesting gradations and shifts in ecological space and ecological time, and then trajectories over evolution. And I think that's going to be really fun. It's going to be really hard. And it means we're all going to have to get out of our little research silos of like the one thing we study. But I would say that's my long-term goal in that way.
It's fascinating, and it really highlights the complexity of each and every of these relationships. Is amazing, and it holds so much opportunity for the future. So thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been an honor, and I've really enjoyed it.
Well, this was a lot of fun for me too. So good luck. Keep at it.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you everyone for listening.